We're joined now by Chris Hattingh and DA's Ghaleb Cachalia, discuss a little bit further solutions to avoid protracted industrial actions that dent our economy. Ghaleb, let's begin with you. I mean, are you at all surprised that the parastatal managed to find some wiggle room to get to this 6%? I mean, an increase in Transnet fixed salary base at this particular point was inevitable and unavoidable, and therefore the operating costs are climbing. Already the wage bill sitting at 66% reported, particularly at Transnet. Did you expect that they would come to this?
Well, look, you've put your finger on it when you say the wage bill is at 66%. What is required here is a whole of society approach. And I understand that in normal circumstances, and I would be a champion of it, the importance of collective bargaining in society and in industry. But we are faced with a difficult and different situation here, both in Eskom and in Transnet, which are monopolies. And we have a situation here where the cozy relationship between the tripartite alliance in government allows for a degree of ransom to be held against society in general and the operation of these monopolies in particular. We are not in normal circumstances here. The lights only just came on 2 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago to allow me to actually have this interview. And Transnet is on the verge of explosion in terms of being able to deliver. We know where the ports sit at, what they are able to do and what they are unable to do. We've seen the World Bank report, which has listed us as the least attractive ports across some 300 odd ports in the world, from a base where we were up in the top. Now, these things have to end. If we understand that both Eskom and Transnet in particular in this instance, are the biggest drawers on the fiscus in terms of money inputs and bailouts. Eskom already draws hugely and is going to get more, and Transnet is set to do so. Despite the clever accounting that has gone on, there's been a loss that has been posted in real terms, and that is going to continue. This adds to it in no uncertain terms. And let's also understand that these workers in these two industries, in these two monopolies, represent, if you like, the aristocracy of labor. They are 40% of people unemployed in this country, 70% of youth unemployed in this country. Those are figures which are out of the ballpark. And we have to take that into consideration when people who are in decent employment with decent wages actually hold the country to ransom and prevent the fiscus from earning important monies in terms of exports and the industries that feed that. If we don't understand that, then we will just be heading off the cliff, which I talked about.
Chris, given the operational and financial performance that Ghaleb has already highlighted of the business, is this increase sustainable?
Good evening, Thabo and Mr. Cachalia, and to the viewers as well. Thank you for the opportunity. I think given that the fiscus has benefited from a commodities boom for the last 2 years, the government will have a little bit more wiggle room. But you have to remember we have to pay off our debt and the interest upon that debt. So whatever wiggle room there was in the first place is going to be eaten away very quickly. Now this wage increase is going to put more pressure on the fiscus, and there will be other pressures in other government-owned companies, entities, for similar increases because the precedent has effectively been set. So as we head towards the end of the year with the ANC's elective conference, again, those factors of the tripartite alliance playing into things, heading towards 2024 with the national elections and the ANC under more pressure, I think there's a very high probability that this won't be the last instance of this sort of action, and it won't. I don't think this sort of thing is at an end. To account maybe for the other side of the argument, you've got employees, workers under a lot of pressure with a declining economic environment. But if we don't get the basics of running our ports and rail effectively in a lean, mean sort of way, then those jobs are going to be lost in turn. So Transnet at some point will down the line maybe have to cut jobs, and then more and more people will not be employed. So I think this might be a short-term win in some ways for some players, but over the long term, I don't think this fixes the fundamental issues that Transnet and doesn't set South Africa on that better path going forward. In a global context of emerging markets which are going to struggle, we've got lower demand from places like China, from Europe, lower demand for our commodities. We need to set ourselves apart. We need to differentiate ourselves from other emerging markets. How do we get more investment? How do we get our ports, our railway going? It's not through, I think, maintaining an entity like Transnet exclusively.
Now, with the pressure that this has brought on, Ghaleb, many were already saying the writing is on the wall that Transnet will somewhat have to buckle. I mean, the South African Association of Freight Forwarders was warning of, for example, a strike that would continue for another week and would begin to impact on groceries. For example, popular retailers will start seeing some stock rapidly diminishing on the shelves. So at some point, Transnet would need to buckle. But in order for Transnet to buckle, government, I suppose, would need to step in and help the group financially. Government already hinting that this is what they are planning to do. As a Democratic Alliance, would you support, I suppose, let's call it what it is, another bailout for Transnet, especially considering the kind of pressure that we have been seeing for the last 12 days?
Look, the history of bailouts has been a very sorry one. There has been huge amounts of bailouts. There are differing figures which are put forward, but they run into the hundreds of billions over many years, over decades. And the bang for the buck for the bailouts has been extremely sorry. So when that's the case, you have to come to the conclusion and say, well, if this hasn't improved matters, if in effect they've got worse over time, then what are we going to do? Now, there has been a sort of rearguard action from government to say, well, we need to bring the private sector in and we need to move more in that direction. Well, I applaud that, but it is too little too late. It has to be done with speed, and it has to be done in proper negotiation with the private sector. For example, in Transnet, bringing in people on a 2-year basis on rail slots and having them have to deal with their own issues around security of the rail is a very parlous place for people to get involved in, and they'll balk at it. There's no one on the cards right now who's champing at the bit to say, yes, I want a slot on the terms that you have offered. Similarly, in the ports, we need to privatize things. And privatization is the way to go, simply because, and I'm not, let me make it clear, that I'm not a particular champion of state-owned enterprises or privatization. But when the market failure is clearly on the lap of one, and in this instance, state-owned enterprises, then we have to look at the other. And we have to say, let us move in that direction. And if we don't go there, we are in for a very stormy ride.
Chris, BLSA and Business Unity South Africa are indicating that, hoping to avert the industrial action, Transnet wanted to impose an avoidance of strike levy on companies. Is that something that could be workable?
I don't think so in terms of a very harsh economic context, in terms of changing things on the ground, supply and demand, again, the high inflation issue, the higher prices issue. If you sort of lock these things in longer term, it makes it more difficult for businesses to adapt on the ground, to change their own operating procedures, maybe to adapt some of their prices, their pay packages, that sort of thing. I think it makes it more rigid and more difficult to operate. I can understand some of the intention because you want some kind of sort of certainty going forward. You don't want things to just grind to a halt. So you want to give yourself that sort of caveat, that parachute, as it were. But I don't think it solves anything really longer term. I don't think it ensures that the underlying issues are solved. I go back to what I mentioned in the first answer, just the short-termism of this sort of thing and trying to paper over the cracks instead of thinking longer term and how we solve things going forward. So getting more, I think, transformative and sort of energetic private sector involvement, but in the long run, I think solve these problems better than sort of having this tick box mentality where let's get these caveats in, let's paper over things quickly, and then we think the problems are solved long term.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll check more of your thoughts. 072-110-5584 solutions that could ensure that we avert protracted industrial action that dents our economy, like the one we've seen at Transnet. We'll take your views on that. Chris Hattingh and Ghaleb Cachalia stay on with us. In Focus continues in a moment. Back live with you tonight. Of course, the latest developments in as far as the Transnet strike is concerned is that Transnet has now signed a deal with the majority union there, Untu. Untu saying that this was a deal at least closer to CPI, like 1.6% away from it, and they felt this was the best offer that they would possibly be able to get out of this, and hence they signed, and they are, of course, now getting back to work from tomorrow. Meanwhile, Satau still going ahead with the industrial action, saying they are looking for the two-digit increase in terms of their wage negotiation. We're with Chris Hattingh as well as DA's Ghaleb Cachalia talking solutions to avoid protracted industrial action that could dent the economy. Let's get your thoughts as well. 072-110-5584. You're saying, Chris, this is a short-term fix given the financial state of Transnet. We're dealing with high levels of inflation. There are fiscal constraints, and of course, you've already mentioned that there are stresses that businesses are currently under. So, what could be done? Because there is still a gap between what Transnet is offering as a wage and what striking unions demand, and it will continue to be there. How do we close that gap?
I think this is more of a maybe macroeconomic argument, but if we can lessen the risk points or the stress points that a state-owned entity represents, that will lessen the risk of this sort of thing happening in the future. So if you have competition in the ports and rail, for example, you don't just have the pressure point at one failure. So if, for example, we have more strike action in the future, it might be isolated to one or two ports, for example. If you have some kind of devolution in terms of Cape Town municipality or City of Cape Town running Cape Town Harbour, maybe same in eThekwini, that sort of thing, maybe that'll help with lessening the risk of a national strike affecting everything around the country. If you can get some of that macroeconomic policy right with competition in the ports and rail, then you've got more economic growth happening. So you've got more opportunities for workers, you've got opportunities for upskilling, development, that sort of thing, which in turn means hopefully higher wages, more business activity, more opportunity for exporters, especially in mining and agriculture. So you've got more profit moving around, and that doesn't mean that union members and workers have to feel that they have to go through this battle every 3 to 5 years where they're pushed into a corner and things are so high stakes that there's no sort of win-win. It's more of a win-lose or a lose-lose situation. So if you get some of the macro points right, I think you can get more growth going, and in turn then people sort of around the table will feel, I think, more empowered going forward.
Is there a condition, Ghaleb, that needs to be attached to these multi-year agreements, right? 6% first year, 5.5% second year, 6% in the third year. What we have seen, for example, in the public sector is reluctance from the unions to get into these multi-year agreements because government reneged on one of the years. I think it was the 2018 agreement that they reneged on in the public sector. Quite surprising that Untu went for it. I don't know if Satau is going to go for the multi-year agreement. But is there a condition that you think we could put in place so that in these multi-year agreements there are some performance deliverables that we are looking at?
Performance deliverables are always important, and unions have always countered that to say that that is not the way they negotiate. And that is terribly, terribly sad, because unless you have performance agreements, then you cannot actually monitor things and calibrate things properly. But I've yet to see a union agreement which factors that in, which is a problem for these multi-year agreements, because they then just based on an increase that is negotiated with the entity, regardless of how well it's doing or not. Now, that brings into question whether what do you value? Are jobs within Transnet more valuable than the jobs less lost as a result of this? In the berry industry, for example, which will lose 30,000 workers as a result of the strike, and the loss in the mining sector, which will lose workers as a result of this, and the cumulative loss of income in those sectors, which will impact the fiscus and those particular companies. These are very pertinent points, which are not on the agenda of an agreement between unions and the entity. As I called earlier on for a whole of society approach, and I think that's absolutely necessary. I'm old enough to remember and actually to have lived through the 3-day week in Britain, which brought Britain to its knees, and then ushered in Margaret Thatcher when she took on the unions, in the coal unions in particular. And that actually, whether you like it or not, or whether you like her or not, and there are all kinds of issues at play here, dragged Britain out of the dark ages into where it was for many, many years, which was a resilient economy that was working within multilateral institutions like the EU and the like, and was actually a powerful and important place to live. That's where we want to be. And every attitude taken and every stance taken in this regard by unions, which doesn't take that into consideration, which doesn't take other jobs into consideration, which only takes their jobs into consideration in an industry which is declining and is hurting, like Transnet and Eskom, then we are in deep trouble, as I've said. And that change has to happen. And that change can only happen with a change of mindset. These other things are just tinkering, shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic, if you like.
Yeah. The NC will tell you, Ghaleb, that Transnet is what? A strategic asset, a strategic state-owned entity. So they wouldn't go for wholesale privatization of Transnet at this particular point. The Mineral Council accounts for what? 80% of the rail business that goes through Transnet and about 50% of the group's income. Is there some kind of structured deal, for example, that government would do with a body like that?
Well, these bodies need to be more vociferous on this particular issue because they are hurting and their workers are hurting, as I've said, and the agricultural workers as well, which represent a significant body of workers who are employed in this country. And those jobs are nebulous. They're here today, gone tomorrow, dependent on Transnet and the like. And if that isn't dealt with, then we are in trouble. These bodies have to be vociferous and have to take on government, just as the union has. We have a tripartite arrangement in government at the moment, which doesn't actually have a voice for business. And business has been, only when it hurts them do they respond. It's time to respond.
Chris, DA saying completely privatize. Will Transnet fare better as a private entity, and what of the jobs that, of course, would have been lost?
So I think the important point is that neither privatization, completely private, nor completely state-owned is a panacea for all the problems. It's about getting the incentives right, the systems, that sort of thing. If you can lessen the risk factor and the probability of things like inefficient processes happening, corrupt contracts, cronyism, if you can lessen that by bringing in more private sector players, you lessen the possibility of inefficiencies. It's not going to guarantee perfect happiness across the board. It's not a sort of utopia solution. I don't think it should be couched as such, but it does increase the probability that you'll have competition and more skills development. At this point in time, with our reports being as lowly ranked as they are on world indices, we need all the development and investment that we can get. We need all the technological advancement that we can get. So it's a move more along that sort of spectrum, I think, towards some measure of more private sector agency, dignity, ownership, maybe taking responsibility in that way, having that sort of buy-in on the ground. Because it's one thing to be maybe part of a business lobby and saying we want X and Y, but it's another thing, when you're on the ground sort of thing and you really have to run things in that way. And if you don't, then the market forces will mean that your business goes elsewhere, and that means that you have to in turn perform better. At the moment, with Transnet being the monopoly, the incentive isn't there to fundamentally reform. So we can give bailout after bailout, we can change the boards, we can do all that sort of thing, but you don't affect the operations on the ground because there's no fundamental incentive to do that.
Let's turn now to your comments tonight on 072-110-5584. Anonymous saying, if Transnet is struggling as they claim, how did Porsche Derby score 8.5 million rands of a bonus? They should stop being selfish. This is beyond them. It's the economy we are talking about. If we're losing 1 billion a day when not working, clearly when we work, we make more. Porsche needs to accept that. We are not stopping until we get what is due to us. No work, no pay for now. But eventually we will get what we deserve. Those are some of your thoughts tonight. Much appreciated. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on and helping us in this conversation.